The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse seemed to loom over Eleanor, like the gates of a prison she hadn't been sentenced to, yet couldn't leave. It was a Tuesday morning, gray and rainy, the kind of weather that soaked right through a coat and settled into your bones. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter around herself, shivering not just from the cold, but from the dread that had been living in her stomach for weeks. She stepped inside, shaking off her umbrella, and the noise of the city, the honking cars. The rush of people was instantly cut off by the thick silence of the law. The building smelled of old paper, floor wax, and that distinct, metallic scent of anxiety that hangs in the air of places where people's futures are decided. Eleanor walked slowly, her heels clicking on the polished floor. She felt small here. Everyone else seemed to know where they were going. Lawyers in crisp suits marched past with folders tucked under their arms, talking urgently into phones. Police officers stood by the metal detectors, looking bored. But Eleanor felt lost. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't a criminal. She was just a woman who had lost her husband and was now fighting to keep the life they had built. She found the courtroom and paused at the door. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed the front of her skirt. It was a simple black skirt, one she had worn to funerals, and now to this battle. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was larger than she expected, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches that looked like church pews. At the front, the judge's chair sat high and imposing like a throne. Overlooking the two tables where the lawyers would sit, Eleanor walked to the front and sat on the bench on the right side. That was her side. She clutched her worn leather bag to her chest. It was the only thing she had brought with her, and it felt heavy, though she knew it was just papers inside. Or maybe the weight was the memory of Thomas, her husband, the man who had always handled the hard things. The man who was supposed to be sitting next to her right now, holding her hand, telling her it was going to be okay. But he was gone. A sudden heart attack 2 months ago had taken him away, leaving a silence in their home that was deafening as she sat there. Looking at the empty wooden table where her lawyer should be, she felt a wave of loneliness wash over her. She was alone against them. Thomas's business partners, men he had trusted, men he had worked alongside for 20 years, were trying to take everything. They claimed that before he died, Thomas had signed over his share of the company to them. They claimed he was confused, sick, and mentally unfit. They were trying to say that the life he had left for her didn't belong to her anymore. A few minutes later, the door on the other side of the room opened. A man walked in. He didn't walk. He strutted. This was Robert Sterling, the lawyer representing the partners. Eleanor had seen him in the hallway once before, but up close, in the bright light of the courtroom. He looked even more intimidating. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Eleanor's car. It was perfectly tailored, hugging his broad shoulders, not a wrinkle in sight. His hair was cut short and neat, and his shoes gleamed so much they looked like mirrors. Sterling walked to his table with the confidence of a man who owned the building. He didn't even glance at Eleanor. He just tossed his briefcase onto the table and started organizing his papers. He moved with a sharp, aggressive energy, like a predator preparing to hunt. He shuffled through documents, stacking them into neat piles, checking his expensive watch, tapping his pen on the table. It was all a show, Eleanor realized. He wanted everyone to see how busy and important he was. He wanted her to see it. Eleanor looked down at her hands. They were shaking slightly. She hated herself for being afraid. Thomas had always told her she was stronger than she thought. "You're the rock, Elle," he used to say, especially when the business was tough and money was tight. But she didn't feel like a rock right now. She felt like a leaf in a storm. Sterling had a team of people behind him, resources, money, and years of experience twisting the law to fit his needs. She had a public defender who was overworked and looked barely older than a college student. Her lawyer. A young man named David finally arrived. He looked tired. He sat down next to her and gave her a weak smile. "Okay, Eleanor. You ready?" he asked, his voice lacking the steel she needed to hear. She nodded, even though she wasn't ready at all. "I think so," she whispered. "Don't let him get to you," David said, lowering his voice. "Sterling is going to try to make you look confused. He's going to try to make you cry." Just stick to the facts. Eleanor swallowed hard. I know, she said. But knowing it and living through it were two different things. The bailiff called out, "All rise," and the judge walked in from a side door. The room stood up. The judge was an older woman with sharp eyes and a stern face. She sat down and looked over her glasses at the two tables. "Let's begin," she said. Robert Sterling stood up immediately. He buttoned his jacket as he walked to the center of the room. He didn't look at the jury. He looked straight at Eleanor. It was a look that made her skin crawl. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a look of pity, fake pity, like she was a bug he was about to step on. "Your Honor," Sterling began. His voice was smooth, deep, and commanding. It filled the room instantly. "We are here today because of a tragedy of a man's life ending too soon, and a tragedy of a business left in chaos." He gestured toward Eleanor, but he didn't look at her. He looked at the jury as he pointed. But behind the veil of a grieving widow lies a much simpler truth. Eleanor felt her breath hitch. He made her sound like a villain. "Thomas Vance was a great man," Sterling continued, his voice full of mock sorrow. "But in his final months, his mind was failing him. He was confused. He was scared. And he was vulnerable to outside influences." He paused for effect, letting the silence hang in the air. "My clients, the partners, tried to help him. They tried to guide him. But unfortunately, Mrs. Vance here." He finally turned and looked directly at her, his eyes cold. She saw an opportunity. She encouraged his confusion to secure a legacy she didn't earn. "That's a lie," Eleanor whispered, but no one heard her. David stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. There is no evidence of that." "Sustained," the judge said, narrowing her eyes at Sterling. "Stick to the evidence, Mr. Sterling." "My apologies, Your Honor," Sterling said smoothly, not looking sorry at all. He turned back to the jury. "The facts are simple. The transfer of shares was signed. It was witnessed. It was legal. And now the widow wants to rewrite the will because she's greedy." The word greedy hit Eleanor like a slap in the face. She looked at the jury. She saw 6 men and 6 women watching her. Some looked sympathetic, but she saw a few of them frowning. They were listening to Sterling. He was so sure of himself, so calm, he sounded like he was telling the absolute truth. She wanted to stand up and scream at them that she wasn't greedy, that she just wanted to keep the house Thomas loved, that she didn't care about the millions, just the memories. But she sat frozen. The fear was paralyzing. Sterling sat down, looking pleased with himself. The judge nodded to David. "Call your first witness, Mr. Evans." David stood up slowly. He looked nervous. "The defense calls Mrs. Eleanor Vance," he said. Eleanor's legs felt like lead as she stood up. She walked past David, toward the witness stand. It felt like the longest walk of her life. She could feel Sterling's eyes on her back. She climbed the steps, sat down in the chair, and placed her hand on the Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the bailiff asked. "I do," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. She sat down and looked out at the room. The lights seemed brighter here. She felt exposed. David walked over to the stand. He asked her simple questions first. Her name, her address, how long she had been married to Thomas. She answered them steadily, her voice getting a little stronger. "And did you ever discuss the sale of his shares with Thomas?" David asked. "No," Eleanor said clearly. "He never mentioned selling. He told me he was worried about the partners, though. He thought they were hiding money from the company. He was going to look into it. But he never mentioned selling his share to them. Never. He said he would never leave the company because it was our future." David nodded and sat down. "Your witness," he said to Sterling. Sterling stood up. He didn't rush. He buttoned his jacket again, a slow, deliberate motion. He walked toward the stand, but he didn't go behind the podium. He walked right up to the rail, stopping just a few feet from Eleanor. He leaned in slightly, invading her space. He was too close. She could smell his expensive cologne, a sharp, woodsy scent that made her feel sick. "Mrs. Vance," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone. like they were old friends chatting over coffee. "You say your husband was worried about his partners," as she said. He was also taking a lot of medication at that time, wasn't he? He had heart medication and painkillers for his back. Sterling nodded sympathetically. Painkillers. Strong ones. Morphine-based, correct? I think so. The doctor prescribed them. Did you ever notice him getting confused? Forgetting things? Maybe mixing up names? Eleanor hesitated. Sometimes. He was tired. Tired, Sterling repeated. Or perhaps he paused, mentally incompetent? No, Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly. He knew who he was. He knew who I was. Sterling smiled a thin, tight smile. Did he know what day it was? Did he know where his bank accounts were? Did he know how to sign his own name without shaking? He was sick, Eleanor said, tears stinging her eyes. But he wasn't an invalid. Really? Sterling asked. He picked up a paper from his table and walked back to her. Because according to these medical records you provided, he was experiencing significant cognitive decline. He couldn't even drive to the store by himself in the last month. That was because of the dizziness. Eleanor cried out. Dizziness caused by the illness, Sterling said sharply, his friendly mask slipping for just a second. An illness that clouded his mind. And you were right there, weren't you? Taking care of him? Signing checks for him? Speaking for him? I was his wife, she said, her voice trembling. I loved him, or you loved what he was worth, Sterling said softly, just loud enough for the jury to hear. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Sterling, watch your tone. I'm sorry, Your Honor, Sterling said, stepping back. I'm just trying to understand how a sick, confused man managed to make such a complex business decision without his wife. Guiding him, walked back to the table and picked up another document. This was the contract Thomas had supposedly signed. He held it up. You say he never told you about this, Mrs. Vance? But you were with him 24 hours a day. Isn't it possible that he told you and you just forgot? Or maybe, Sterling paused, looking at her with a look of pure disdain. Maybe you convinced him to sign it, promising him he could go home and rest if he just did what you said. And now you're lying to us to keep the money. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The accusation hung in the air. The jury was looking at her now, really looking at her. She saw doubt in their eyes. She saw suspicion. Sterling had painted a picture of a manipulative wife preying on a sick old man, and it was working. She felt trapped, like an animal in a corner. She opened her mouth to deny it, to scream that it was a lie, but the words wouldn't come. The lump in her throat was too big. She looked down at her hands in her lap. She remembered the night Thomas signed that paper. She remembered the fear in his eyes. He wasn't confused that night. He was terrified. And he wasn't signing the paper to give the company away. He was signing something else entirely. But she couldn't say that. Not yet? Nothing to say? Sterling asked, his voice smug. No defense for taking a dying man's legacy away from his partners. Eleanor gripped the edge of the stand until her knuckles turned white. She wouldn't break. Not here. Not in front of him. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, forcing the tears back. She had to be strong. She had to be the rock Thomas said she was. She forced out, looking up and meeting Sterling's gaze. Her voice was shaky, but it was there. I am not lying. Sterling stared at her for a long moment, a smirk playing on his lips. He knew he was winning. He could feel it in the room. He turned his back on her and walked back to his table, the job done for the day. No further questions, he said. The judge looked at the clock. We will reassess until tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned. Eleanor sat there for a moment, stunned, as the room began to empty. The noise of people packing up and talking filled the air, but it sounded muffled to her, like she was underwater. She had survived the first day, but barely. Sterling had humiliated her. He had made her look like a fool and a liar in front of the jury. And the worst part was, he was just getting started. She knew tomorrow would be harder. She knew he had more traps, more insults, more lies to throw at her. She slowly stood up, her legs weak. She picked up her bag and walked down the steps of the witness stand. As she walked toward the door, she saw Sterling laughing with his clients. They were clapping him on the back, celebrating. They looked like they had already won. And as Eleanor pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the rainy afternoon, she felt a cold fear settle in her heart. But under that fear, deep down, a spark was starting to grow. A spark of anger. She wasn't going to let them win. Thomas hadn't trusted them. He had known this was coming, and he had left her a way to fight back. She just had to be brave enough to use it. The rain hadn't stopped by the time Eleanor woke up the next morning. It drummed against the bedroom window, a steady, rhythmic reminder that the world was still gray and cold. She stared at the empty pillow beside her for a long time before forcing herself to get up. She had to go back to that courtroom today. She had to face Robert Sterling again. Getting dressed felt like preparing for a battle she didn't know how to fight. She chose a blue blouse, one Thomas had said, brought out her eyes, hoping it would give her a shred of confidence. When she looked in the mirror, though she just saw a tired woman trying too hard to look brave. She grabbed her bag, the one with the hidden compartment where Thomas had told her to keep the important things in, headed out into the damp air. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere felt different today. The hallway buzzed with low murmurs. It seemed that word of the first day's drama had spread. Eleanor could feel eyes on her as she walked to the same wooden doors. She kept her head down, clutching the strap of her bag. It felt heavier today, burdened not just by papers, but by the crushing weight of what she had to protect. When she entered the courtroom, Sterling was already there. He sat at his table, relaxed, sipping a cup of coffee. He looked like a man enjoying a morning show, not a lawyer fighting a high-stakes lawsuit. He glanced up as Eleanor entered, his eyes scanning her slowly from her head to her toes. It wasn't a friendly look. It was the look a wolf gives a sheep before it lunges. He smirked, a tiny, almost invisible twitch of his lips, and went back to his coffee. David, her lawyer, arrived moments later, looking even more tired than he had the day before. He sat down next to her and immediately started shuffling through his stack of papers. He didn't look at her. "David," Eleanor whispered, leaning in. "How do you think it went yesterday? Be honest." David sighed, finally looking up. He looked worried. "It's not great, Eleanor. The jury. They like Sterling. He's confident. People trust confidence. And he managed to paint you as, well, someone who might be taking advantage." Eleanor felt a sharp pain in her chest. "But I didn't." "I know that," David said quickly, patting her hand. "But we have to prove it. Today is going to be hard. He's going to bring in experts to talk about Thomas's health. You need to stay calm. If you get angry, he wins. If you cry too much, he wins. You just have to answer the questions." The bailiff called the court to order. The judge took her seat, looking stern and serious. "Let's proceed," she said. Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket with that same deliberate, practiced motion. "The defense calls Dr. Raymond Voss to the stand," he announced. Eleanor watched as an older man in a white coat walked into the room. He had a kind face, but his eyes were serious. He took the oath and sat down. Sterling walked over to him, his manner friendly and respectful. "Dr. Voss," Sterling began, "please tell the court your relationship to the deceased." "I was Thomas's primary care physician for the last 5 years of his life," the doctor answered. His voice was calm, but Eleanor felt her muscles tense up. "And in your professional opinion, how was Mr. Vance's mental state in the months leading up to his passing?" Dr. Voss hesitated. He looked down at his hands. "Mr. Vance was very ill. He suffered from heart failure, which restricts blood flow to the brain. In the final weeks, yes, there was confusion. He suffered from episodes of delirium. He would forget where he was. He would have trouble recognizing faces." Eleanor gripped the edge of the bench so hard her fingers hurt. She remembered those moments. They had been terrifying, fleeting moments where he would look at her like she was a stranger. But those moments would pass, and he would be himself again. Sterling paced slowly in front of the jury box. "So, it is possible, is it not, that during one of these confused episodes, he could have signed a document without fully understanding what it was?" "It is possible," the doctor admitted. "And is it also possible," Sterling pressed, "that someone close to him could have guided his hand?" "Told him what to sign?" The doctor looked over at Eleanor. His expression was sad. People in that state are very suggestible. They trust the people around them, They want to be helpful. So yes, if someone he trusted told him to sign a paper, he likely would have done it, just to please them or to stop the questioning. Sterling stopped pacing. He turned and looked directly at Eleanor. "Thank you, doctor." "No further questions." David stood up. He walked over to the doctor, looking a bit more energized. "Dr. Voss, did Thomas ever have moments of clarity?" "Oh, certainly," the doctor nodded. "Delirium often comes and goes. There were days when he was perfectly sharp. And on the day the document was signed, do you have records of his mental state?" "I do not," the doctor said. "I wasn't present." "So it is also possible he was having a moment of clarity?" David asked. "It's possible," the doctor agreed. "But given the progression of the disease, it is unlikely he was at his peak mental performance." David sat down. It wasn't the win Eleanor needed. The damage was done. The jury now had a medical professional saying Thomas was easily manipulated, and Sterling had connected the dots to point right at her. But Sterling wasn't done. He called another witness, then another, a nurse from the hospital, a business partner who claimed Thomas had forgotten his own birthday at lunch. Each witness added another brick to the wall. Sterling was building around Eleanor a wall of doubt and suspicion. He was creating a picture of a man who had lost his mind, and a wife who had used that to her advantage. By the time the afternoon rolled around, Eleanor felt exhausted. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. She couldn't stop it. She just had to sit there and listen as they tore apart Thomas's legacy. Then Sterling stood up and looked at the judge. "Your Honor, the defense recalls Mrs. Eleanor Vance to the stand." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She had to go up there again. She looked at David, who whispered, "Just stick to the truth. Keep it short." She stood up and walked to the stand. Her legs felt heavy. She sat down, took the oath, and faced her tormentor. Sterling didn't rush this time. He walked slowly around the courtroom, letting the silence stretch. He wanted the jury to watch her sweat. He wanted them to see her fear. Finally, he walked up to the stand and leaned against the rail, crossing his arms. He didn't look at the jury. He just stared at her with a mixture of boredom and cruelty. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice low and casual. "Yesterday, you told us you were with your husband 24 hours a day. Is that correct?" "He didn't want to be alone," Eleanor stammered. "So you were there when he took his medication?" "Yes." "You were there when he ate?" "Yes." "And you were there when the business partners came to visit?" "Sometimes." "Did you ever leave the room?" Sterling asked sharply. "Did you ever leave him alone with them?" Eleanor thought back. There were times she had to go to the bathroom, or answer the phone, or make tea. I might have stepped out for a minute." "A minute," Sterling repeated. "Or maybe 10 minutes? Long enough for them to convince him to sign the shares over while you were conveniently out of the room?" "No," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "He wouldn't have done that because he loved you?" Sterling mocked. "Because he told you everything?" "Yes." Sterling raised an eyebrow. "Did he tell you about the gambling debt, Mrs. Vance?" The room went silent. Eleanor blinked, confused. "What?" "There was no gambling debt. Thomas didn't gamble." Sterling looked at the judge. "Your Honor, I have evidence of large cash withdrawals from their joint account in the weeks before his death." "That's a lie." Eleanor cried out. "I took that money out." Sterling spun around to face her, his eyes wide with fake shock. "You took it? For what?" Eleanor's face burned. She had promised Thomas she wouldn't tell anyone, but now she had no choice. "I took it to give to his sister. Her husband lost his job. They needed help. Thomas made me promise not to tell anyone because he didn't want his partners to think he was soft." Sterling let out a loud, disbelieving laugh. A few people in the courtroom actually chuckled. He shook his head, looking at the jury with a pained expression. "So let me get this straight. You stole money from a dying man's account, without his partners knowing, to give to his sister. But now you want us to believe you wouldn't trick him into signing a paper to save yourself from losing your home?" "I didn't steal it," Eleanor said, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "He told me to do it. He wrote the check himself." "Did he?" Sterling asked softly. He walked to his table and picked up a copy of a check. He held it up. Because this check has your signature on it, Mrs. Vance, not his. Eleanor stared at the paper. It was true. His hands had been shaking too much to hold the pen that day. He had asked her to sign it for him. She explained this frantically, but Sterling cut her off. So, he was too weak to sign a check, Sterling summarized loudly. But he was strong enough to sign a complex business contract, transferring millions of dollars. Which is it, Mrs. Vance? Was he helpless, or was he a genius? You can't have it both ways. He knew what he was doing. She screamed. Objection! David yelled, standing up. Sustained. The judge banged her gavel. Mr. Sterling, you will stop badgering the witness. Sterling held up his hands, looking innocent. I'm just trying to find the truth, Your Honor. He turned back to Eleanor, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The truth is, you used him. You controlled the money. You controlled the pills. And when the partners came asking for the shares he promised them years ago, you saw a chance to keep it all for yourself. Eleanor felt like she couldn't breathe. The walls were closing in. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, judging her. They saw a greedy, manipulating woman. Sterling had twisted the truth so skillfully that even she began to doubt herself for a second. Answer the question, Mrs. Vance, Sterling demanded, stepping closer. Did you manipulate your husband? No, she whispered, her voice broken. I can't hear you, he said, cupping his ear. Did you manipulate him? No. Then explain the check, he shouted, slamming his hand down on the rail of the witness stand. Eleanor jumped back, terrified. The judge was banging the gavel, telling Sterling to sit down, but Sterling didn't move immediately. He leaned in one last time, his face inches from hers. You are a fraud, Mrs. Vance, he hissed, so quietly only she could hear, and we all know it. He turned and walked back to his table, leaving her trembling in the witness chair. The silence in the room was absolute. Eleanor looked out at the sea of faces. The jury looked disgusted. The judge looked angry, and Sterling was smiling as he sipped his water. David stood up. Mrs. Vance, are you okay? She barely heard him. She nodded numbly. She wanted to run. She wanted to hide. But she remembered the bag at her feet. She remembered the envelope inside it. Thomas had told her, they will try to break you, Elle. Let them think they won. Then, when they least expect it, you show them who we really are. She wasn't ready to show it yet. Sterling was too strong right now. If she showed the evidence now, he would find a way to twist it, just like he twisted the check. She had to wait. She had to let him get comfortable. She had to let him think he had destroyed her completely. No further questions, David said, sounding defeated. The judge looked at the clock. Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow. Eleanor slowly stood up. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She grabbed her bag and walked down the aisle. As she passed Sterling's table, he didn't look at her. He was busy packing his briefcase. Looking like a man who had already won the lottery, Eleanor pushed open the heavy door and stepped into the evening. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still dark. She stood on the steps of the courthouse, clutching her bag. She wiped her eyes, drying the tears on her sleeve. She took a deep, shaky breath. He had humiliated her. He had called her a liar and a thief. He had made her feel small. But as she walked toward the bus stop, the fear in her heart began to harden into something else. It wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. Sterling thought he knew her. He thought she was just a sad, grieving widow who would roll over and give up. He thought he had already won, but he was wrong. He had played his hand, and he played it well. But he didn't know about the cards she was still holding. She touched the outside of her bag, feeling the bulk of the hidden envelope. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow is the day. She got on the bus, sitting alone in the back, watching the city lights blur past the window. She wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not for Thomas. And not for herself. Asterisk, the morning of the third day felt different to Eleanor. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of her mind, but it had changed. It wasn't a cold, paralyzing frost anymore. It had hardened into something sharp and hot. It was anger. Pure, clean anger. She looked at herself in the mirror before leaving the house. The woman staring back looked tired, yes, but her eyes weren't wide and scared like they were yesterday. They were narrow and focused. She didn't look like a victim today. She looked like a woman who had nothing left to lose. The courtroom was quieter when she arrived. Perhaps the drama of the previous day had drained everyone, or maybe they were just waiting for the inevitable conclusion. The newspapers in the lobby were already calling her the greedy widow. She saw one headline as she walked past the stand. Inheritance battle takes ugly turn. She didn't buy a copy. She didn't need to read about how the world saw her. She knew the truth. Robert Sterling was already at his table when she walked in. Today he wasn't sipping coffee casually. He was standing, looking at his watch, tapping his foot. He looked impatient, like a man who just wanted to collect his prize and go home. When Eleanor entered, he didn't smirk. He didn't even look at her with pity. He looked at her with boredom. He thought he had already broken her. He thought she was just a formality now, a final hurdle before he could declare victory and cash his check. Eleanor sat down. Next to David, her lawyer looked exhausted. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his tie was loosened. He gave her a weak smile. "Eleanor," he whispered, "I have to be honest with you. I've spoken to the district attorney's office informally. Unless we have a miracle today, it's not looking good. They might push for a settlement, but you'll lose almost everything." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I understand, David. I wish you had told me about the check earlier," he said, shaking his head. It gave him all the ammunition he needed. "I know," she said softly, patting his hand. "You've done your best." The judge entered, and the room stood up. The proceedings began immediately. Sterling didn't waste any time. He called his final witness, a forensic handwriting analyst. The man spent an hour explaining why Thomas's signature on the contested document looked shaky but authentic, and why the signature on the checks Eleanor signed looked controlled. It was boring technical stuff, designed to confuse the jury and make them trust science over Eleanor's word. Eleanor sat still, listening to every word, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the envelope. Finally, Sterling rested his case. He sat down, looking extremely pleased with himself. He buttoned his jacket and leaned back, signaling he was done. "Your Honor," David said, standing up. "The defense calls Mrs. Eleanor Vance back to the stand." A low murmur went through the courtroom. Sterling sat up straight, a look of annoyance crossing his face. He leaned over to whisper something to his clients, shaking his head. Eleanor stood up. She moved slowly, deliberately. She didn't shuffle her feet today. She walked to the stand with her head high. She sat down, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore the oath. She looked out at the crowd, then at the jury, and finally, she locked eyes with Sterling. David walked up to her. He looked nervous. He knew he didn't have much to ask. "Mrs. Vance," he started, "is there anything else you wish to add to your testimony? Anything regarding the document Mr. Sterling presented?" Sterling stood up instantly. "Objection, Your Honor. She has already testified. This is repetitive and a waste of the court's time." The judge looked over her glasses. "I will allow the witness to clarify. Proceed, Mr. Evans." David took a deep breath. "Mrs. Vance, you maintain that your husband was not tricked into signing the shares." "I do," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear. "And you maintain that you did not take advantage of him?" "I loved him," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. "I would never take advantage of him. But Mr. Sterling is right about one thing. There is a document, but it isn't the one he showed you." The courtroom went dead silent. Sterling rolled his eyes and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. David looked confused. "Mrs. Vance? What document are you talking about?" Eleanor reached down to the floor where she had placed her leather bag. Her hands were steady as she unlatched the flap and reached inside. The sound of the metal clasp opening echoed in the quiet room like a gunshot. She pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with red wax, the wax seal Thomas used for his personal letters. She held it in her hands for a moment, feeling the texture of the paper. This was it. This was the weapon Thomas had left her. Sterling was watching her now, his bored expression gone. He was leaning forward, his eyes narrowed. "I have here," Eleanor said, her voice ringing out, "a letter written by my husband 2 weeks before he died. And a recording." Sterling exploded out of his chair. "Objection. This is highly irregular. She never disclosed this in discovery. She is withholding evidence." "Order." The judge banged her gavel, but she was looking at Eleanor with intense interest. "Mrs. Vance, what is the meaning of this?" "Your Honor," David said, finding his voice, "we were not aware of this evidence." "I was waiting," Eleanor said, looking directly at the judge. "I was waiting for Mr. Sterling to show his true colors. I was waiting for him to lie to this court about my husband's state of mind. I needed to see exactly how far they would go to steal what is mine." Sterling's face was turning red. "This is a stunt, Your Honor. She's trying to sway the jury with theatrics." "Let me see the envelope," the judge commanded. Eleanor walked over to the bailiff and handed it to him. He passed it to the judge. The judge broke the red seal and opened the envelope. She pulled out several sheets of handwritten paper and a small USB drive. She read the first page, her eyes moving quickly. Then she looked up at Sterling. The judge's face was stern, almost angry. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, "this letter appears to be a sworn declaration from the deceased, dated and signed. It explicitly states that he was being pressured by his partners to sign over his shares. It states that he refused." "That can't be," Sterling sputtered. "She forged it." "She's a liar." The judge ignored him. She took the USB drive and plugged it into her computer. Speakers in the room crackled to life. "Thomas, please just sign it." "We can handle the paperwork later." The voice was clear. It was one of the business partners sitting at Sterling's table. "No," came Thomas's voice. It was weak, raspy, but determined. "I know what you're doing. You're trying to push me out. I'm not signing anything until Eleanor reads it. Come on, Thomas. Eleanor doesn't understand business. Just sign the damn paper." "Get out!" Thomas's voice cracked. "Get out of my house before I call the police." The recording ended. There was a heavy, shocked silence in the room. Eleanor watched the jury. Their mouths were open. They looked from the judge to the partners, who were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Sterling looked like he had been punched in the stomach. His confident mask had shattered. He looked at Eleanor, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Real fear. He opened his mouth to speak, to object, to spin a new lie, but he had nothing. The recording was undeniable. Thomas Vance had been of sound mind. He had been bullied, and he had protected his wife. The judge took off her glasses and looked at Sterling. "Counsel, it seems your clients have committed perjury, and it seems you have harassed a grieving widow based on false pretenses." Eleanor stood at the witness stand, watching the man who had tormented her for 3 days. He looked small now. He looked pathetic. He wasn't a predator anymore. He was just a man caught in his own trap. Eleanor finally allowed herself to smile. It wasn't a big smile, just a small curve of her lips. She looked down at her hands and thought of Thomas. "You did it, love," she thought. "You saved us, it appears," the judge continued, her voice booming through the room. "That we have seen all the evidence we need to see." Asterisk, the sound of Thomas's voice. Weak, but filled with that familiar, stubborn determination. Seemed to hang in the air like smoke long after the recording had stopped. The silence that followed in the courtroom was heavy, thick, and absolute. It wasn't just a quiet moment. It was a vacuum where all the arrogance and confidence had been sucked out of the room. Eleanor stood by the witness stand, her hand resting gently on the wooden rail. She watched the jury. For the first time in 3 days, they weren't looking at her with suspicion or pity. They were staring at the defense table with their mouths slightly open, their eyes wide with shock. The shift in the atmosphere was tangible. The narrative Sterling had so carefully built the story of the greedy, manipulative widow and the sick, confused husband had just crumbled into dust. Robert Sterling didn't move. He stood frozen behind his table, one hand hovering over his legal pad. His face, usually so controlled and masked, was pale. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, catching the light. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a solid floorboards, only to find it was actually a trapdoor. He opened his mouth to speak, to object, to yell, to do something to stop the reality of what was happening, but no sound came out. The recording had taken the words right out of him. The judge slowly removed her glasses and looked over the rims at Sterling. Her expression was no longer bored or impatient. It was thunderous. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice low but carrying clearly across the room, "would you care to explain why this evidence was not disclosed during discovery? Or why your client stated under oath that Mr. Vance willingly signed the documents?" Sterling finally snapped into motion. He adjusted his tie, though it didn't need adjusting. He cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor," he stammered, his smooth delivery gone. We were not aware of the existence of this recording. My clients have always maintained that." "Your clients are on tape?" the judge interrupted sharply, pointing a finger at the men sitting next to him. "I heard them." The jury heard them. That is not a willing signature. That is a clear attempt to coerce a dying man. The partners were shrinking in their seats. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, was looking at his shoes. The other was frantically whispering to Sterling, his face a mask of panic. They weren't the powerful businessmen who had walked in on the first day. They looked like scolded children caught with their hands in the cookie jar. Eleanor watched them. A strange sensation washed over her. For weeks, she had been the victim. She had been the one chased, the one hiding, the one afraid. But as she stood there, listening to the judge tear into the lawyer who had tried to destroy her, she felt the fear finally drain away. It left her feeling light, almost weightless. She looked at Sterling, really looked at him, and realized he wasn't a giant. He was just a bully. And like all bullies, when someone stood up to him, he shrank. David, her lawyer, walked over to the judge's bench and handed her the letters that had been in the envelope. The judge scanned them quickly, her eyes narrowing. "These are dated logs," she announced to the room. Mr. Vance documented every time these men approached him. He wrote down their names, the dates, and exactly what they threatened him with. He wrote, "I am signing nothing until Eleanor is safe. They are trying to rob her." The judge looked up from the papers and stared directly at the defense table. This is premeditated fraud. Not just a civil dispute, but criminal conspiracy. The courtroom erupted into gasps and murmurs. The bailiff had to bang his gavel on the wall to restore order, but the energy was electric. People were turning around in their seats, looking at Eleanor with new respect. The narrative had flipped completely. She wasn't the villain anymore. She was the hero who had outsmarted them all. Sterling tried one last desperate move. He stepped forward, his face flushed. "Your Honor, this proves nothing. This woman could have fabricated these recordings. Her husband was sick. He was paranoid. Anyone can write a diary." Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't get angry. She just reached into her bag again and pulled out a small card. It was a receipt from a digital forensics firm, dated the day after Thomas died. She handed it to David. "Your Honor," David said, his voice suddenly strong and confident. "These recordings were authenticated by an independent third party the day after Mr. Vance passed away. Mrs. Vance took them there immediately. She didn't hide them to use them later. She was waiting to see if these men would come forward and tell the truth. She wanted to give them a chance to do the right thing. They didn't." Sterling sank back into his chair. He looked defeated. He knew the game was over. There was no way to spin authenticated forensic evidence in a handwritten diary. The jury was no longer buying his act. The foreman, a serious-looking man in the front row, was shaking his head in disgust at Sterling. The judge picked up her gavel and slammed it down hard. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "I have seen enough," she stated. "Mr. Sterling, sit down. I am dismissing this case with prejudice. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented of fraud and coercion, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation." A collective cheer went up from the back of the courtroom. It was spontaneous and loud. The judge banged her gavel again. "Order!" I will have this courtroom cleared if there is another outburst." Eleanor didn't cheer. She just exhaled. It was a long, deep breath that felt like the first real breath she had taken in months. She looked down at her hands, remembering Thomas. He had known this would happen. He had known they would come for her. He had spent his last remaining energy not on mourning his own life, but on protecting hers. He had set the trap, and she had been the one to spring it. David turned to her, a huge grin on his face. "Eleanor," he whispered, "you did it. You won." She nodded, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "We did it, David." She looked back at Sterling one last time. He was packing his briefcase, his hands shaking. He was shoving papers in blindly, not caring if they were folded or crumpled. He wouldn't look at her. He couldn't. He gathered his things and signaled his clients to leave. They stood up, keeping their heads low, and shuffled toward the side door, looking for all the world like criminals heading to a holding cell instead of free, men walking out of a court as they passed the aisle where Eleanor was standing. The tall partner accidentally bumped into her shoulder. He stopped and flinched, expecting her to yell or move away. Eleanor didn't move. She stood her ground and looked him in the eye. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look she gave him was colder than anything he had ever felt. It was the look of a woman who knew his secrets and had just destroyed his life with a single piece of paper. He shrank away, pulling his coat tight around him, and hurried out the door behind Sterling. The courtroom was buzzing now. Reporters were typing furiously on their laptops. People were whispering about the scandal. But Eleanor felt a quiet peace settle over her. The noise was just background. She walked back to her bench and sat down to collect her bag. Her hand brushed against the leather where the envelope had been. It was empty now. The evidence was in the judge's hands, part of the public record. The secret was out. The burden was lifted. She realized she wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. She was the owner of the company Thomas had built. She was the protector of his legacy. And she was stronger than she ever knew she could be. The courtroom doors had closed behind Sterling and his clients, but the noise inside the room was still buzzing like a disturbed beehive. Eleanor sat on the wooden bench for a long moment, just letting the reality wash over her. It wasn't a wave of happiness exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when a terrible toothache finally stops hurting. It was relief. It was the feeling of being able to breathe again without a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. David, her lawyer, was busy gathering papers into his briefcase, but he stopped and looked at her. His face was flushed, and for the first time since they had met, he looked genuinely happy. "Eleanor," he said, his voice full of wonder, "do you realize what just happened?" "The case is dismissed. With prejudice. That means they can never come after you again. Not for this, not for anything." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I know," she whispered. "It's over." "You were incredible," David said, shaking his head. "When you pulled that envelope out, I have to admit, I thought you had lost your mind. But you played him perfectly." Sterling is used to bullying people. He didn't know how to handle someone who was actually holding all the cards. Eleanor looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking anymore. "I didn't do it to be clever, David. Thomas told me to wait. He said Sterling would show his true colors if I let him talk long enough. Thomas knew him. He knew how arrogant he was. He said, 'Let them hang themselves, El. Then you pull the rope.'" "Well, they are definitely hanged," David said, zipping up his bag. "The district attorney is going to have a field day with those recordings. Sterling isn't just going to lose this case. He's probably going to lose his license." Eleanor stood up. She smoothed the front of her skirt and picked up her bag. It felt light now, despite the papers still inside. She walked toward the center aisle of the courtroom. As she moved, people stepped aside to let her pass. Some of them nodded respectfully. Others just stared, as if trying to figure out how this quiet woman in the blue blouse had just taken down a legal empire. She reached the heavy double doors at the back of the room and pushed them open. The hallway was chaotic. Reporters with cameras and notepads were swarming. They had been outside, but now they were trying to get into the courtroom to see the fallout. Mrs. Vance. One of them shouted, shoving a microphone in her face. "Is it true you have recordings of the partners threatening your husband? Did you know Sterling was going to lie?" Another one yelled, "How does it feel to win?" Eleanor stopped. The bright lights from the cameras blinded her for a second. A month ago, this attention would have terrified her. She would have wanted to hide. But today, she didn't feel like hiding. She looked into the camera lens, thinking about Thomas. She thought about all the times he had come home from the office, tired and angry, complaining about how these partners were cutting corners. She thought about how hard he had worked to build that company. "I didn't win anything," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the noise. The reporters quieted down to hear her. "I just protected what belonged to my husband. Those men tried to steal his life's work because they thought they could bully a grieving woman. They were wrong." "Are you going to run the company now?" someone asked. Eleanor adjusted her bag on her shoulder. She thought about the office, the big desk with the view of the city, the ledger books Thomas loved. "I'm going to make sure Thomas's legacy is honored," she said simply. "That's all that matters." She pushed past them gently and walked toward the exit. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon air. It was still gray, but the rain had finally stopped. The air smelled wet and clean, like the city after a storm. Eleanor stood on the top of the courthouse steps. Below her, life was going on as normal. Cars were driving by. People were walking to lunch, talking on their phones. The world hadn't stopped because she had won her case, but somehow, her world felt brand new. She looked down the street and saw Sterling. He was standing on the corner, trying to flag down a taxi. He looked frantic. His perfect coat was buttoned wrong, and his hair was messy. He was on his phone, shouting at someone, his face red with anger. He looked small and pathetic from up here. A taxi pulled over and Sterling jumped in, slamming the door. Eleanor watched the yellow car merge into the traffic and disappear. She realized she didn't feel any joy in his misery. She just felt indifference. He didn't matter anymore. He was just a bad chapter in a book that she was closing. She took a deep breath and started down the steps. Her knee gave a little twinge, a reminder of her age, a reminder of the stress she had been carrying, but she kept going. She felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't the peace of having everything solved. She still had to go home to an empty house. She still had to sort through Thomas's things. She still had to figure out how to run a company she didn't fully understand, but she had herself back. For the last 2 months, she had felt like a ghost floating through her own life, defined only by her loss. Sterling, in his cruelty, had forced her to become something else. He had forced her to become a fighter, and in the fire of that fight, she had found a part of herself she thought had died with Thomas. She reached the bottom of the steps and began walking toward the bus stop. She didn't feel like taking the bus, actually. She felt like walking. She wanted to feel the pavement under her feet. She wanted to see the shops, the trees, the people. She passed a flower shop on the corner. The smell of roses and lilies drifted out to her. Thomas used to buy her lilies on Fridays. "Just because it's Friday," he would say. Eleanor stopped. She dug into her purse and pulled out her wallet. She walked into the shop. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully. "Hi there," the young woman behind the counter said. "Can I help you?" "I'll take a bunch of those lilies," Eleanor said, pointing to a bucket of bright pink flowers. "And a dozen white roses, please. Special occasion?" the girl asked, wrapping the stems in green paper. Eleanor smiled. It was a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Yes," she said. "It's a very special occasion. It's a new beginning."
Ow.
She paid for the flowers and walked back out into the street. She hailed a taxi this time. She wasn't tired anymore. She had work to do. She had a company to save. She had a life to live. As the taxi drove through the city streets, Eleanor held the flowers on her lap. She looked out the window at the buildings rushing by. She thought about Thomas. She hoped he was somewhere watching her, proud that she hadn't let them win. She imagined him chuckling, that deep, warm laugh of his, at the look on Sterling's face when the recording started. "You did good, Elle," she heard him say in her mind. You did good. The taxi pulled up in front of her house. It was a big old house with a porch and a garden that needed weeding. It looked quiet and waiting for her. Eleanor got out, paid the driver, and walked up the path. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. It was silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound. Usually, this silence scared her. It reminded her that she was alone. But today, the silence felt friendly. It was peaceful. She walked into the kitchen and put the flowers in a vase. She filled it with water and set it on the table where they used to eat breakfast. The pink lilies brightened up the whole room. Eleanor took off her coat and hung it up. She went to the desk in the corner where Thomas used to work. There were still stacks of papers there. The business ledgers, the partnership agreements, the things Sterling had tried to use against her. She sat down in his leather chair. It still smelled like himmeled wood and peppermint. She pulled a stack of papers toward her. She didn't know how to read all the numbers yet, but she would learn. She would hire accountants she could trust. She would fire the people who had betrayed Thomas. She would take her time. She picked up a pen and clicked it open. She wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. She was the owner of Vance Industries. She was a woman who had faced a wolf in court, and one, Eleanor smiled at the empty room. "Okay, Thomas," she whispered. "Let's get to work."